Wilderness experiences. We are to view difficult experiences in our lives as opportunities to grow and mature in our faith. Here's Gene.
When we face difficult experiences, if indeed we can see this as an opportunity, and that's one of the most difficult things to do, to see it as an opportunity to grow and mature in our Christian faith, and I might add, to be a better witness for Jesus Christ. Now, Moses states two purposes in the passage here in chapter 8 as to why God allowed them to wander in the wilderness. The first purpose was to discover what was in their hearts. Would they be motivated to obey God's commandments when they face difficult circumstances? And that's stated right here in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2. Remember that the Lord your God led you on the entire journey these 40 years in the wilderness so that he might humble you and test you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. There was purpose in that wilderness experience. Second purpose, to discover if they could handle prosperity. Would they honor and glorify God rather than taking credit themselves? And we see that in verses 16 and 17. He fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers had not known, in order to humble and test you, so that in the end he might cause you to prosper. You may say to yourself, my power and my own ability have gained this wealth for me. He put them to the test to see indeed if they would honor him even in prosperity. And so, two purposes. And I believe that this really relates back to James chapter 1 in terms of opportunities, that God gives us opportunities in the midst of these crises. And this is what James wrote. Consider it a great joy, not a joy that causes you to just jump up and down with laughter. This is talking about a deep-seated joy that you know God, and even in the midst of persecution, you can have peace. Even in face of difficulty, as we see illustrated in our brothers and sisters sometimes when they're in dire straits, even physically, to say, God has given me peace in the midst of this. Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, but endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. And there's a principle there from James chapter 1, which I've called principle 1 in James, persecution and trials. When we face various trials, we should ask God to help us view these painful experiences as opportunities to become more mature in our spiritual walk with Jesus Christ. And folks, that's not easy. That is not easy. And yet, God is able to give us the grace and the strength in the midst of those difficulties to see it as an opportunity. And if we can see it as an opportunity, I've discovered at least, and I'm sure you have as well, that God eases the pain in the midst of that situation, gives you a whole different perspective in terms of what you can learn through this difficult experience. And that leads us then to a question. What are some of the more specific lessons we can learn in times of difficulty? And we could talk a lot about that because all of us have different experiences, but one of the things that it does test is the depth of our commitment to Jesus Christ. And in that test, it takes us even deeper into our relationship with Christ, if indeed we can see this as an opportunity and not become angry and walk away from God, but rather walk towards God in learning what God wants to teach us in our relationship with him. Another is it tests the degree of our humility, because through these difficult experiences, it deals with those elements of pride that are so easy to creep into our lives. And it helps us to develop the trait that God wants us all to demonstrate, and that's true humility. Nothing to be proud of in ourselves, but rejoicing only in Jesus Christ. It helps us to keep our eyes on Jesus. not to get our eyes off the Lord. It helps us to internalize our faith. It helps us to rely on God, and particularly in prayer. And as I was reflecting on that question, even in my own life today, on the weekend, I was struggling with a test in my own life, a rather painful test in relationship to relationships, very important relationships to me. And I remember that as in conversation with my wife, as she shared with me by phone a situation that gripped my heart. And I remember sitting and worshiping with these men, and as I was worshiping, the intensity of my prayers over that situation was far greater and more significant than if I hadn't had that test. And I believe that through tests, God brings us to the place where we can pray more fervently for people and situations in our lives. It focuses us. And sometimes it takes pain to enable us to be able to do that in order to really wrestle with God. And I found that to be true in my prayer life. I wish I didn't have to admit that my prayers are not as intense when I don't have that kind of pressure. But I do know that under that kind of pressure, my prayers become far more intense and focused in relationship to that particular situation. So I believe that God really, through tests, enables us to rely more on God rather than on ourselves. So the principle reads, we're to view difficult experiences in our lives as opportunities to grow and mature in our faith. And I believe that was one of the things that really we see illustrated so beautifully in the life of Joseph, as even when he was in prison, he saw this as an opportunity to be able to fulfill God's plan for his life. Now, in some respects, he didn't see the real opportunity until he had gone through it. And then he looked back and told his brothers, look, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good. If we can just see that God means it for good in the process, rather than at the end of the process, it can help us to work through that process, that wilderness experience, and really learn and see it as opportunity and experience that internal peace and joy that James was talking about in the midst of difficult trials and circumstances.